Hello, and welcome to Pharmative Live. I'm Dr. James Partyka. I'm your host. I'm a clinical pharmacist, research scientist, and the founder of Pharmative.com. And I welcome all of you here today to our interactive healthcare forum called Pharmative Live. Today we have a special topic that we will be presenting with regards to finding a treatment for COVID-19. And generally we keep these forums to about 15 or 20 minutes. They're getting a little bit longer lately because there's so much healthcare news to discuss. But we look forward to emerging data. We look forward to effective treatments. And we look forward to trying to find the best way to combat COVID-19 moving forward. And as you know, we always talk about, at Pharmative, we always talk about the benefits versus the risks and versus the cost. And here we're talking about really what are the benefits. Time to clinical improvement, reduction in mortality rates would be the two endpoints that most of the studies right now are looking at. Of course, the side effect profile of some of the drugs that we're looking at, we want to understand better. And then, of course, in general, we want to understand which patients would benefit the most from which treatments. We want to understand what the optimal dosage is, the schedule of that dosage, when should that drug be administered if it is determined effective early versus later. And we want to understand more about the virus itself and how it spreads throughout the human body, and then, of course, what that particular virus is sensitive to or not. And, of course, we do want to make a statement with regards to standard test kits. In order to be able to treat COVID-19, we need to be able to test for the disease, and that's very important, especially for those patients moving on to clinical trial. In the United States, that problem seems to be resolving, but yet there still is a limitation of standard test kits. So unless we have those test kits, we don't really know who has COVID-19. I just want to also start off by saying that Pharmative Live is sponsored by our exclusive PNN Plus Health mobile app. And you can go to your Apple and Android stores and download those apps for free. They're what I call forever free, which means that it's our way of giving back and our way of providing not only stellar entertainment and news, but also providing you healthcare news and insights and information free of charge. So that's PNN Plus Health mobile app. You just search for PNN and you'll see Pride Nation Network. And not only does it, like I said, have great healthcare information, for example, information from the Centers for Disease Control, as well as the National Institutes of Health. But it also has a doctor symptom checker where it's a chat bot and you can enter your symptoms and it can give you a differential diagnosis that you can discuss with your healthcare team about what's, ailing you, what sorts of problems you may or may not have based upon the doctor symptom checker. It also has a virtual pharmacy where you can look up various drugs that are approved by the FDA and their side effects and appropriate dosing and precautionary statements. So that's Pharmative Live, and we do have a great retro cartoon and TV station associated with it. We have retro classic films, and we have Sky News and all sorts of things there on your PNN Plus Health mobile app. So Pharmative Live is sponsored by PNN Plus Health mobile app, and that's our commercial for this entire broadcast today. All right, so as I was preparing for this report, it made me want to first thank all of the research scientists that are out there, all the healthcare professionals, all the doctors and pharmacists and nurses who have done so much in managing drug therapy, but also in conducting clinical research trials, which are needed for the treatment of COVID-19. So thank you, all of you people that are so hardworking, working every day out there, taking care of the patients. conducting the clinical trials and research, which is so much needed in order for us to be able to understand what are the effective treatments and safe treatments out there. So that's the first and foremost. The second point I want to start off by saying is that when I was preparing again for this particular report on COVID-19, I was thinking about the AIDS and HIV patient population out there. And I was a young clinical pharmacist training in county hospitals and academic hospitals out there when the first AIDS patients were being admitted into the hospitals, and we really didn't understand how to manage many of the complications associated with AIDS, pneumocystis, tuberculosis, many other complications as well, including Kaposi sarcoma and so forth. And it was really a very challenging time, and we did our best to, again, manage not only the disease, but also manage the infectious disease complications. And it was a scary time because we really didn't know much about HIV, and we didn't have any anti-HIV drugs out there as well. They were still in development, and then with the emergence of the first one, AZT, we didn't understand how to appropriately dose in order to treat HIV. But again, over 35 years, a lot of research has been done, and now there are 222 FDA-approved drugs for the treatment of HIV and AIDS. And today, a patient outcome, a gold standard, is a patient diagnosed with HIV today is considered to have a normal life expectancy as a person that does not have HIV. So in 35 years, we made tremendous progress in treating this disease. So again, I want to put a shout out and a thank you to people like the late, great Elizabeth Taylor, Sir Elton John, and many of the foundations out there and the charities out there, such as Art for Life, that have made a difference really in the treatment of AIDS and HIV. And without them, our community would not have flourished like it is today. So there's a lot of knowledge in understanding how the HIV virus replicates and how it impacts our immune system. And that knowledge now is being used to treat other other viral diseases, such as COVID-19. So viruses are very tricky. They're very smart. And they're just a code of messenger RNA. And there are other types of viruses as well, that once they get inside a host, like a human being, their goal is basically to invade, replicate, and unfortunately that triggers an immune response in us on how best to be able to fight the disease. And in this particular disease, which enters through your mouth, your nose, and your eyes, gets into the back of your throat, so you may feel sore throat, it replicates, and then of course it wants to continue to invade, and it invades into the lungs, and you develop an inflammatory response and thick mucus. So those patients with COVID-19 that are experiencing shortness of breath, those are the patients that we really need to get to see a doctor and assess whether they need additional supportive care management, oxygen, or a respirator and so forth, so that we can support them through that point in time where they're not able to really oxygenate their blood, they're not able to breathe appropriately because the infection is in their lungs. And there's deep mucus as well. Later on in the day, I have an audio podcast message from my colleagues at Tampa General Hospital and the University of South Florida, which gives additional precautionary measures to fight the disease. So let's talk about some numbers and facts. We know that those people that are positive with COVID-19, 80% of them will do fine and they'll recover okay, and they'll be fine. Approximately 15% of patients, they're usually vulnerable populations, with comorbidities, older patients, and so forth, might have to go to the hospital for supportive care management, oxygen intubation, and other supportive care measures. And then approximately, and again, this is a crude mortality rate because we don't really know the denominator in the United States yet because we haven't been testing yet in a routine fashion. And we haven't adjusted it for other factors such as age or country and so forth. But we think the mortality rate is somewhere between 1 to 2%. It could be even higher in other countries. So those are the numbers, those are the facts. So the majority of people will recover from COVID-19, but there is a vulnerable patient population out there that needs to be extra special precautions, such as social distancing themselves and staying at home. Okay, so moving on, it's important to realize that if we approach this from a scientific method, develop hypotheses, develop well-designed clinical trials and studies, again, we can determine which drugs may be the most safe and effective for treating COVID-19. So the next part of this broadcast is we're going to discuss a little bit about clinical development, and then we're going to talk a little bit about those available treatments that are undergoing clinical trials now. First and foremost, I want to say to you, there are no proven treatments for COVID-19 available. And there are no vaccines available. Those particular two groups of studies, the ones that are looking at preventative measures through vaccines, those studies have just started. And knowing those results is going to take some time, and I'm talking about 1 to 2 years before we have a bit understanding if the vaccine is effective in preventing the disease. The treatment studies are just underway as well. There are compassionate use studies as well. But as far as drugs that the FDA would consider safe and effective, though there are none at this point. There are some agents that are of promise and of scientific interest, but today we do not have any proven safe and effective treatments against COVID-19. And that's an important point. We certainly have some promising agents, and we have some doctors and scientists that are screening libraries of different drugs, looking for the right drug that can hit COVID-19. So that is underway, and with luck, within 2 or 3 months, we should have a number of other investigational agents that, once they have determined to be safe and effective, and we have an understanding of the dose through preclinical and animal studies, we can move forward with clinical trials as well. Because one thing we don't know is, we don't know if this virus will come back. So we will treat effectively with supportive care measures, the epidemic that we're all undergoing in the United States. We will treat them effectively with supportive care measures, but we don't know what's going to happen 6 months to a year down the road, and if the virus will come back or not. We're still learning about the virus, and we talked about this last time, or the time before it last, about the virus is similar to other coronaviruses. SARS is one, MERS is another one. And so, but again, we have to understand again more about the pathogen and more about whether the virus will spread and the resurgence of the virus. So what research we're doing now, and even though we might not have results till the end of the year, it may help us with other viral epidemics as we move forward in time. Okay, so in general, when we talk about drug development, we start off in the laboratory, in vitro testing, like test tube testing and petri dish testing, all in glass. And then we look at activity levels, and then those that look promising and have antiviral activity, we take it into animal testing to try and understand the toxicity profile and the appropriate dose to take into human testing. And then once those agents, those potential agents, are screened and looked at in preclinical testing, then we decide which ones look the most promising to take into human testing. And human testing starts off with phase 1, where we're looking at safety and dose, establishing an effective dose to take forward into phase 2, 3, and 4. Phase 2, we're looking at efficacy. It's usually 50, 100 patients that we're looking at again to try and understand, are we decreasing the viral load or not? Are we improving patient outcomes? We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, and so forth. Those that are promising at the phase 2 level go on to phase 3. Phase 3 are usually large numbers of patients that are randomized to the experimental arm with the drug of interest, the experimental drug, versus a standard of care arm. And then we, through scientific testing, determine whether or not, and statistical testing, determine whether or not there is a statistical and clinical meaning in the difference between the experimental arm and the standard arm. And that's the best way we can understand whether a drug is effective or not. So if we don't do that kind of rigorous testing, then much of it just becomes, descriptive. We're not comparing it to anything else, so we don't really know whether or not the patient's just getting better on their own, or whether the drug is actually working better than if they didn't take the drug. And of course, we've always talked in Pharmative that every drug has side effects, and some of the side effects from some of these drugs that we're testing right now for COVID-19 have a number of side effects. So we have to be careful and cautious, all right? And that testing from phase 1 through phase 3, and there's even a fourth step. Fourth step is looking at it in the approved indication, conducting a phase 4 study, seeing again if it's safe and effective in the general population apart from rigorous clinical trial testing. That takes about 10 years. Now, there are ways of which we can speed up the process. The FDA works hand in hand with the biotech and the pharmaceutical industry to develop, appropriate, efficient study designs. They have a fast tracking program, especially for patients of unmet need. And that 10 years, if the drug really has robust activity, can be shortened. But again, generally speaking, it takes about 5 to 10 years to establish safety and efficacy of any drug, including an antiviral drug. Now, another way of getting drugs to patients are through a compassionate use program. So the drugs may be available because they're trying to fit an unmet need. So the hospitals and the doctors work with the pharmaceutical and biotech companies to allow them to provide promising agents to them in a compassionate use program. In Europe, they call this a named patient program. And they may receive the drug even though there's still not clear benefit, but it's thought to be essentially safe, relatively speaking. And in this particular sense, it's more important to get the drug to the patient. The third way a drug might be able to reach a patient is if the drugs are already FDA approved. They're already on the market. We understand their dose, their pharmacokinetics, their pharmacodynamics. And in that particular case, in the United States, drugs can be prescribed off-label if there is sufficient evidence, some phase 2 data, which we just went over what phase 2 means, efficacy data, to support that this drug may work in that for this disease as well. Now, in other countries, as in Europe, for example, they're only really allowed to prescribe on label. So they don't have that option. The best option for someone in Europe would be a named patient program. So again, one, we have to get drugs FDA approved or European approved in order to be able to use them for the prescribed indication. Number two, there are compassionate use programs and named patient programs out there where drug manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies provide the drug at no cost to the patient to see if it's effective because of the unmet need at the time, and in this case for COVID-19, for those patients that are having severe respiratory disease and difficulty in breathing and so forth. And then the third way would be drugs that are already approved by agencies out there in the United States that clinicians can prescribe off-label. And again, one of the questions would be whether the insurance company would approve it or not, and that's another hurdle to get the drug to the patient. If we went by the normal mechanisms in the United States, it would take approximately 6, 7 to 10 years unless you get really lucky. So that's how it is now. That's how it is at least today in the drug approval process. There's a great deal of regulatory oversight. Institutional review boards, scientific review committees, the regulatory agencies, the FDA, the European Medical Agency as well, and each country has their own regulatory authorities over drugs which are approved to be available by either prescription or over-the-counter. So, and that's all about protecting the patients. That's all about, again, proving that the drugs are safe and effective, because you don't want to take snake oil. Working in cancer for over 25 years, I get the question a lot about, well, what about, marijuana being used for this type of cancer? I said, well, maybe it has anti-cancer properties, but there's no data out there to support that. You should do the clinical trials, and you should understand what the background and the rationale would be for doing a marijuana for cancer treatment trials. Now, marijuana is approved in certain dosage forms to treat nausea and vomiting, but it's not approved to treat the cancer. So that's one thing, and one very important point. Do the trials. For example, I'll give you another example. Remember, and this is going back a while ago, is that patients with a certain type of cancer were really desperate to seek a cure, and somebody came out with the fact that apricot pits could treat the cancer. Well, what they found out is that cyanide was available. Cyanide, when they crushed the apricot pits, was there, and patients were dying because, again, it was snake oil. There was no scientific data to support apricot pits to treat cancer. And that's unfortunate, too, because what happens is when patients are diagnosed with cancer, and I know we're talking about COVID-19, but we can extrapolate these examples to COVID-19. My expertise is in cancer, so that's why I'm using cancer examples. They're desperate. And people come out to say, this herb or this particular drug will work for your cancer or may help it and so forth, and there's data to support it. Well, if you don't do the appropriate clinical testing, you can do a lot more harm than any good at all. So the important point to know is it sounds hopeful. Some of these agents we're going to talk about now sound hopeful and promising, but we have to do the appropriate testing to understand, again, the safety profile as well as the efficacy profile. And we have to do questions for these particular studies. Which patients benefit the most from the drug? What's the appropriate dose? What's the appropriate schedule? How soon do I have to administer once a person is tested for COVID-19? These are the kinds of questions that we have to really rigorously test. Otherwise, we're kind of shooting in the dark, and we're kind of doing some Pollyanna thinking and magical thinking as to whether this drug will work. So it may cause a lot more harm than any good. So don't think that just because an agent is out there without the rigorous testing that the scientific medical community and the regulatory agencies work in collaboration with, we don't really know whether the drug is safe and effective. And as I stated in the introduction to all of this, and I see a number of people out there, including David and Jimmy, and I see also Karen is on the line as well, we won't know, and therefore we can't build upon the knowledge that we did so successfully well with HIV and AIDS. Over 35 years, we now have over 222 proven agents that work in the treatment of HIV. And that knowledge that we have about how viruses replicate and so forth, that knowledge that we got from those 35 years of rigorous studying, we can apply to other viruses such as the COVID-19. Okay, so now we're going to talk about potential treatments that are now undergoing testing. And this past week's New England Journal of Medicine is mostly dedicated to COVID-19. And the very first study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal, such as the New England Journal of Medicine by Dr. Coe, was looking at lopinavir in combination with ritonavir, which are AIDS drugs. And they were looking at patients in the hospital that had poor outcomes associated with because they were on they were intubated and on oxygen therapy, and they were looking at time to resolution of their symptoms and clinical improvement. And they looked at 199 patients, and this is a typical phase 3 trial. They looked at 199 patients with the disease that met certain eligibility criteria, and they were randomized to receive the combination of drugs and standard of care versus standard of care. And unfortunately, the study demonstrated that there was no difference between the two treatment arms. So this is the first negative trial in COVID-19 patients that demonstrated no benefit, published in a peer-reviewed journal. So we know something about that. That these particular drugs that are HIV drugs do not work for COVID-19. At least that one study proved that. That doesn't mean that if perhaps the drugs were administered early, like for example, you just were diagnosed with COVID-19 but you were asymptomatic, perhaps they may be effective in eradicating the disease. But again, that study wasn't done. So most of, if not all of the studies are being done in those patients that are hospitalized and are desperate in order to improve their overall survival, and those are what's undergoing now. Now, in the lay press and circulating on social media and on some political social media accounts, I was going to say Facebook, Twitter, Instagram accounts, is a study that was done with hydroxychloroquine and zithromycin, and these are drugs that are FDA approved. Hydroxychloroquine is approved for malaria, arthritis, as well as lupus. So these drugs are available. However, the first drug, hydroxychloroquine, is available for malaria. And so malaria, which is a very difficult disease to eradicate in the tropics, right? These patients need the anti-malarial drugs to live. So if we started using this drug for indications with very little scientific merit, it could create a shortage, in the supply of drug for other approved indications. So there are ways to rectify that. Manufacturers can increase the manufacturing and so forth. But this has gotten a lot of media and press because there is a small study out there that have looked at this combination of drugs and demonstrated that they do decrease the viral load and the presence of the virus. That doesn't mean it improves patient outcomes. It doesn't mean it decreases mortality rates, and it does not mean that it shortens the time to improvement, I think is the best way to say that. So particular studies with this drug, there are no clinical outcomes showing that this combination of agents, azithromycin, which is a commonly prescribed antibiotic, and hydroxychloroquine, are efficacious in the treatment of COVID-19. However, the United States, at least, is moving quickly with compassionate use studies or phase 2 studies to allow this combination of drugs to be effective. Because they are FDA approved. We know a lot about them. We know the safety profile, and we know the dose and schedule and so forth. But again, there's no scientific clinical outcome data that is positive with this combination of agents. So again, we have to stick to the facts and stick to the science. That doesn't mean that the trials that we will do with this combination of drugs, that doesn't mean that we won't move forward and find something that does work for these patients with this combination of drugs. And we also have to remember that these hydroxychloroquine, they have side effects such as heart toxicity, they can change arrhythmias, they can cause eye toxicity and so forth. So they're not benign drugs either. So again, the United States is moving forward. I know the state of New York is moving forward. There's a shipment of drug available to treat patients that are very sick with COVID-19, and we will be hopeful. We'll be hopeful that this combination will work, but at this point in time, we just don't know. And then the last drug, which is promising, which is a nucleotide analog developed by a drug manufacturing company called Gilead, is remdesivir. And you probably might have heard this if you're doing a lot of reading or watching news reports online. This drug has been determined to be very effective, not very effective, but I'll say effective or efficacious to some degree against MERS and SARS that are similar viruses to COVID-19. And a small number of patients have been treated. However, again, it's not been done through rigorous testing. So this month in the United States, and I suspect elsewhere in the world, are initiated 3 large trials. They're underway, and they're going to be tested in those very sick patients with COVID-19. And again, it's going to take some time to understand whether or not remdesivir is effective or not. Now, anecdotally, you'll see that there are patients that do report, a positive experience. But again, it's like if I was telling you that vitamin, I'm making this up now, vitamin H, take vitamin H and it's going to really cure the cold, a common cold. I'm not talking about COVID-19. It's just a hypothetical example, right? And then in 4 or 5 days, your cold was gone. Well, your own immune system might have gotten rid of the cold, and 99.99% of people will recover from a cold, right? So you don't really know whether it was the drug or whether it was your own immune system getting rid of the virus, right? So you'll hear these anecdotal single patient reports saying, I took the drug and within 2 days I recovered and I'm feeling fine from COVID-19. Well, again, it might be your own immune system and so forth. So that's why we have to do rigorous testing out there. So I'm on my last note card right now. That means we can wrap up very quickly. Just remember that get your information from reliable sources, from your doctors, your healthcare teams, reputable peer-reviewed journals like the New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA, or there are many other journals out there, through government agencies like the Centers for Disease Control in the United States and the World Health Organization. These are very user-friendly, so you can access some of these resources through your PNN Plus Health app. And that's where the information is really conveyed in a very scientific, objective way, as opposed to getting this information out there. There's so many things to consider when you publish a study, and it has to do with the study design, the patient population, the timing of the dose, the statistical methods that were used in the study, and then there's always bias associated with any study. Small numbers of patients means, again, not as much as if you did a study with large numbers of patients. Assessing the patients appropriately on time through a schedule of events is very important so that you're capturing all the information. And another thing to look out for is if they report study results and there's so many patients that were lost to follow-up. When patients are lost to follow-up, we don't really understand why, unless they explain it in the paper. And again, looking at the statistical tests associated with determining a significant difference. And then once we develop a statistical significant difference, is that clinically relevant? If you save 1 day of an improvement in COVID-19, some people would say that's great, but does that really reduce mortality rates? And so forth. So there's a great deal of rigorous testing. Let's rely on the infectious disease experts and the research scientists and not the politicians to understand how best to treat COVID-19. So that's it for today's Pharmative Live. I look forward to seeing you next week. And we always end our live sessions by saying, stay healthy, because it's easier to prevent disease than it is to treat disease. And so that gives me that little extra message to say, follow what the local and state officials are saying with regards to social distancing and staying at home and trying not to spread the disease. And that's the best way we can fight the disease right now. So with that, I'll say, see you next time. Stay healthy.